Okay, thanks, Lars. Now I just share the screen here. Can you all see the screen? Great, yes. So thanks, Lars, for this nice introduction, and welcome everybody else in this very special situation. So let's say it's quite frustrating, I have to say. My experience is now with lecturing over Zoom, because you just talk to your computer, you know, and normally you don't even see any pictures and stuff. But the good side of it is, I guess we are in the middle of a socio-technical transition. So we're part of a big innovation wave that is happening right now about how we lecture and how we diffuse and disseminate and exchange information. So I guess that's, we have to take the costs, the downsides to it. Just now, funnily enough, I don't have my own slides on the screen, but I guess I will still manage. Let me just the Zoom looks sort of different this time, but okay. So let me just say that, here it works, yes. My topic is about globalization and sustainability transitions, or in other words, how can we think about sustainability transformation or innovation processes happening in different places, why they happen there and not elsewhere, and how they get interconnected among themselves in order to result in some sort of global transformation processes. And sustainability, if anything, is really a global topic, as I will come back to argue about. I hope you had the time to read into the paper that was provided, you know, the global innovation systems, because this will enable me to be a little bit quicker on some parts. And as Lars announced already, out of experience, it will be very dense. And I'm a quick talker, so if it's really too much, please try to stop me, which might be a bit of a challenge here in this system. But I will try to do my best to not steamroller you all too much. Let's say the big structure of the module 4 was already communicated, so I will just provide you with the lecture for 40 minutes. We will have some time for Q&A, then instruction of the group work. You have the group work already on the last few slides. Perhaps you already had time to visit that, but I will come back to it and explain what it's meant to be. Then you will have an hour of group work, and I will be available just to interact with you in case of questions, etc. And then the last half an hour or so, we will have very short presentations of each of the groups, like 5 minutes only, and then a very short wrap up. I hope this will sort of work out in terms of time. We will see how it goes. So let me just start with the lecturing, and I have structured it in 6 points. So first of all, why do we even need a geographical perspective? You might have heard about that already, but I would add my 5 cents to it, and end it with a short illustration on the sort of poster child of sustainability transition actual dynamics in the last 30 years or so. Solar photovoltaic dynamics, nationally in Germany and then globally. And this leads me to ask, so what is the global dimension of innovation dynamics, and what are the sort of frameworks that we had already, and what does it even mean? And then present the global innovation system as a sort of an integrative framework to better understand the global, or rather the multi-scalar structure of these transformation processes. And then finalize with say, well, how can you measure these structures and processes? Because it's not so that with the standard approaches that we have in national context, it's quite difficult. So you have to also be a bit innovative in terms of methodologies, and then of course provide some outlook on a global agenda. So why do we need a geography perspective? I guess that the first thing I would like to elaborate is, what is sustainability transitions research grappling with? What's the riddle it wants to solve? And it helped me to put it in like 3 big boxes that are interrelated. So the first big topic is obviously, and this has been the founding myth and the start of everything, was to say, well, how can we understand and assess early developments in the formation of social technical confederations or industries or transformations, transitions, etc. And when very early, all the alternatives, they don't look very strong or convincing by any means. It's rather laughable. It's sort of hopeful monstrosities, that has been called in evolutionary ecology. So they lack performance, cost competitiveness. They confront high numbers of barriers. And how can you still already early on detect and identify what are the crucial mechanisms to really get it started and potentially lead to something bigger? Let's say the other side, the flip side of the coin is then, well, how can we understand the sort of stabilizing forces? How can we overcome path dependencies? And we have resistance at many levels, like incumbents with sunk costs and being not very favorable to disruptive innovations, but also on the side of users. So how can we overcome this if really there's sort of more fundamental transformations at stake? And the last very important element compared to many other approaches, let's say in economics, is to say, well, normally when we talk about sustainability transitions, we're not talking about things that will work out automatically by silver bullets technologies and innovations for the better, but you always have this sort of public policy component. And so you're dependent on the support of public policy, and this has, of course, then a connection to politics and all these issues. So essentially, it's all about conceptualizing, understanding, measuring, assessing deep social technical transformation processes, not only shifts, marginal shifts in the configurations we know. There's been a lot of research on that over the last 30 years, of course, and you've been exposed to that. So why should we bother about the spatial dimension? What's really the specifics that come in, and what's the riddle there? You know, why should we bother in the first place? So I would say, first, if you're interested in sustainability and how our technical structures could change in the future to accommodate more for sustainability concerns, the first thing that's obvious is that the problems are often located at the global level. There's either global environmental change or global developments that, of course, also have local components, but you have to address them in some way or another for the entire globe. You cannot just become sustainable for the Netherlands and don't care about the rest. This wouldn't make a lot of sense, of course. On the other hand side, we see that also in terms of solutions, we have some aspects that are global, like industry dynamics are growing increasingly global. You see here the share of the manufacturing share of renewable technologies or energy technologies, and you see that China is by far leading, but also India, South Africa, Brazil play a very important role. So it has become a sort of a global business already. On the other hand side, you have like national policies, and we don't have really global industrial policies by any means. And many of the actual transformation processes, they work out at the level of the regional or even local scale. So I guess one of the core questions is, if we want to grapple with these sort of global transformations, we have to address processes that happen at the local scale, at the regional scale, at the national scale, even at the global scale. And they're sort of mutually interdependent, and how can we better understand how we have to analyze this, and then, of course, also, you know, how to intervene from a policy or strategy point of view. If you look at the actual focus of transition studies until very recently, you see that most of the studies that had an empirical focus, they looked at the national level. And why is this? Because, of course, a lot of the policy, you know, the industrial policies, the regional policies, etc., are formulated at the national level. Also, when you then look which countries, you know, were in the focus, then you see lots of Western Europe kind of countries that were in the focus. It has changed a little bit, but there's still very interesting question that you raised before, you know, what's the geography of sustainability transitions research? I see very strong focus on Europe, of course. But that would be a different discussion to say. But let's say also conceptually, or in its application, also the core concepts like the multi-level perspective or technological innovation systems had a very strong national focus. So the question is, well, are these frameworks just fit for addressing this sort of multi-scalar processes and to accommodate for the spatial scale? Or do we have to moderate them? Do we have to extend them? Do we have to be more sensitive to this sort of spatial dimension? And of course, you anticipate we have to. So what does it even mean to be geography, to talk about geography conceptually? I guess I have like 4 dimensions that to elaborate that. So the first thing is certainly to be cognizant of the local context. So let's say, how can we identify where a new transition or a new innovation process is more likely to happen than another? And this has probably to do with certain conditions that are not there ubiquitously, but they're very specific to certain regions or even locales or countries, etc. And how can we identify, these context conditions and the ability to embark on transition processes? A subsequent question is then also, our, let's say, regime structure or innovation system structures that we tend to think of, are they spatially homogeneous, or do we see, like, let's say, stronger regimes in certain parts and weaker regimes in others, stronger availability of niche processes, etc.? So we would, in the consequence, also say that certain places have perhaps weaker regime structures and stronger niche structures, and these are the places where transitions would happen more easily. But it's not only about the local and about geography in a descriptive sense, but it's also about how get the different developments in different places interconnected, and can we then think or approach, let's say, these transformations from a global perspective and identify what happens where and how it gets interconnected. So recently there has been proposals about global regimes, or how we will just discuss later, global innovation systems. And what does this even mean? How does this change the fundamental concepts that we're used to work with? And the third dimension is, of course, that's very dear to geographers, because when you start to look at differences in space, you will also immediately be confronted with the problem of who wins and who loses by a certain development. So the whole justice and power dimension is hard to blind out. It's much more easy if you're an economist and say, well, in the end, everything will trickle down and everyone will profit. We just don't look in exactly where exactly. But whereas geographers have to, confront this almost on a daily basis. So the whole question about, who's in a better position or not, and who will gain, who will lose, is very important. And I would say that the last dimension, which was not yet in the literature, but I guess it's worthwhile to single it out, is sort of what I would call the leveled agency. So let's say that the agency structures, they have often a very strong territorial dimension. So governments are either responsible for communities or for regions or for countries. And we have little structures, the government structures that take care of the global, of course. Companies may be operating on a regional scale, national scale, international scale, etc. So how can we, these actors that want to contribute to sustainability, operate in these multi-scalar contexts? So if you have there's thousands, a plethora of initiatives of the sustainable Ruhrmond or the sustainable Interkappelen or the sustainable, take it whatever, small community that want to become sustainable in themselves. So how do these initiatives relate to the bigger picture? And how can we assess whether this makes sense or not in any foreseeable sense? So let me just illustrate this, because this is sort of quite abstract talk, but just illustrate, provided with 2 slides on the actual transition processes that we can meanwhile see in a specific field of renewable energy technologies, and more importantly, photovoltaics, which for me is sort of the poster child of transition studies, if you want. So if we go back into the 2000s, let's say the decade from or the mid 90s to 2015, perhaps, we see that the market for photovoltaics was increasing exponentially. You have to see that the y-axis here is logarithmic. This means that these curves are all exponential curves. And around the 2000s, Germany took over the other countries and grew very rapidly over the next 15 years in terms of market. And the general explanation of why this happened is that Germany entered or introduced a feed-in tariff, a national feed-in tariff, quite a strong one, which sort of course, generated a sort of a heyday for photovoltaics companies. and therefore just overtook all the other countries. So in a sense, it's, let's say, a conventional story that national policies create the windows of opportunity where a new technology can thrive. However, as geographers, we were eager to see, well, how does this play out at the level of Germany itself, and how strong is the local variation? And we saw that there is quite a strong variation in terms of implementation of these PV panels, and which cannot be easily explained, neither by the feed-in tariff, because this was sort of uniform across the country, nor if you take into account solar irradiation, etc. So there must be other factors. And we quickly found out that already in the 90s, there was one actor group that played a very important role in setting up all these promotional schemes and building up the PV industry in Germany. And that's what you see here as dots on the map. These were sort of local civic initiatives that wanted to promote renewables in order to decouple from the electricity grid. So they wanted to be locally sustainable, if you want, and they promoted solar photovoltaics in Germany quite heavily. But unlike, what an economist would say, well, first of all, we identified that like 2/3 of them are just in 3 regions of Germany, in federal states, Bundesländer. And when we analyzed them in more detail, we saw that they did not only, let's say, convince other users to install PV panels, but they really had to start to assemble whole systems, technically assemble. They had to build up local value chains, and then to, of course, to convince users to put these PV panels on their roofs. But they had also to tinker with promotional schemes like local feed-in tariffs, for instance, or other things. And they were obviously also active in the politics, so to create constituencies to promote all that. So in a nutshell, they started to create what we called or interpreted as local TIS structures that made the system, let's say the social technical configuration, work as a whole. So it was not only finalized technology that was implemented, but they had to construct also a lot of the institutional environment. With these successful activities at the local scale, they started to increasingly lobby the federal state scale, and new promotional schemes were introduced there. And finally, even at the national scale, the national feed-in tariff was modeled on the basis of these local initiatives. So if you want, the success of the German PV storyline is not so much due to a national policy that was introduced. This was then in the end to push, to really get on the growth path. But the basis for doing that, and the political legitimacy and everything, started the local scale, and was a process that went over many different scales. So the local, the federal, state scale, and then ultimately the national scale. Of course, this is not the whole story, so I guess it is already a strong point about geography. It started somewhere, and then you had sort of activities that grew over several scales. But this was not the end of history, as we know. So later on, if you take a global perspective, we see that the centers of activity, let's see here in terms of manufacturing, shifted over time. So from the US and Japan, then to the EU, and finally, and today as well, to China. And the same is true for the market, which was very big in the mid-period from 96 to 2005 in the EU, but now is sort of, we don't see it here on this graph, but actually now it's dominated again by China. So we see this sort of a long-term shifts at the global level. The centers of activity, that draw on certain local resources, but it's very hard to capture then these processes and say, well, PV has finally been a German invention, but it's sort of a global process. Okay, so I hope this helps you a little bit to get some graphical imagination on what I'm talking about. So this local embedding, and then the multi-scalar processes, and then even you can analyze this at the global scale, So what would it take really if normally, let's say transition studies, they had implicitly, their geographical approach was to say, oh, let's just find somewhere a niche process or a TIS process, in some country or some place. And once we have it and we understand how it can grow, then once it's successful, it will diffuse to the rest of the world. And in particular, it will diffuse across the development gradient, starting in Europe and then finally ending up in some, in some other developing country context or whatever. What if we said, well, this is perhaps happens sometimes, but it's by no means the general way that technologies could develop in the world. Should we not first start with a global perspective and then see where things happen and how they get interconnected, and then to have a global perspective throughout, and not only in the end when everything is gone through. So that's sort of the starting question for the global dimension here. So the bottom up versus the top down versus the bottom up. But before, the question is, why should we even bother? Because perhaps it's not so important actually, the global dimension. But of course, this would be a very weird hypothesis to start with, because we see all over the place, even though it gets very questioned these days in the last 3 months, but let's say before, and I guess it will still continue, and for 3, 4, 5 decades, it was all about globalization in production, migration, knowledge, culture, polity, etc. And also the challenges, as I said before, are all global. And in particular also with regard to transitions research, so we see an increasing number of sustainability experiments all over the place, and clean tech companies or industries getting more and more global, as I showed before. So in transitions research, we saw quite a number of authors and contributions that address this. First of all, our work with Lars on the geography dimension in the first place. Then concepts like global regimes were quite recently developed. There were also some recent overviews on transitions research with the global perspective by Thijs and Lars and Anna Vitorek. And very recently, Lars and I and Christian Binz and Jim Murphy wrote a sort of a correction to this STRN agenda, which from our point of view just got it all wrong again. Those authors that wrote the agenda did not really accommodate for the actual problems of the geography of transitions. So, but I guess what is really missing here is a sort of an integrative framework of the wheres and the global interconnections of sustainability transitions. And that's what I would like to elaborate here. So the first thing is, of course, the transition studies scholars are not the first one to discover that things happen at the global scale. You have quite a number of approaches and literatures in innovation studies, let's say the broader field, who have dealt with or have tried to address this new empirical reality. And a very prominent approach is the global value chains approach, which essentially asks how do companies these days organize their supply chains, where they source labor and productive capacity, and often they just follow the gradient of least cost. And then you have the usual structures that we know very well by now. The geographers came up with a sort of similar concept like global production networks. Both of them had more of production focus, and let's say innovation is more treated like implicitly, but you also have the observation since the early 2000s that also innovation networks grow more and more global, like the Global Innovation Networks concept by Christina Chaminade and Ernst. So let's say there is already quite a lot of concepts out there and frameworks to address the global dimension and production, etc. But they have all some issues, which makes it not very well suited to use it directly as a basis for addressing the global dimension of transitions. So one is that innovation is often not put center stage, let's say, especially in the GVC and GPN literature, or like in the global innovation networks literature, it has a very particular narrow focus on knowledge. So where is knowledge sourced? All sorts of knowledge, but the broader institutional context, etc., are not really addressed. And also, let's say the GPN literature in particular has been self-criticized. The founding authors, Young and Co. Said that it's still rather static and descriptive, and it would need to have sort of a more explanatory stance. So let's say what we came up with, and is to say, well, if you adopt an innovation system starting point, then it's very complementary. It focuses on innovation. It has potentially an explanatory stance and also a more dynamic view. But innovation systems literature has not really dealt with globalization all too explicitly. And so we said, let's just talk about um, let's start with the TIS framework to provide a good starting point. And why would this be? So you have here the elements, the structural and the functional elements of the TIS framework. And let's say the advantages would be that the innovation system tradition has no a priori territorial delimitation, so it's potentially global in reach, and the processes, functions can be developed into an explanatory approach, and it's also potentially dynamic, at least towards an industry life cycle or motors of innovation kind of interpretation. So how do we have to further develop these concepts in order to be able to grasp the global dimension? And this you can, I guess you saw it in the paper as well, you can say, well, first of all, there was a lot of implicit assumptions about all these elements in the conventional TIS studies, namely that actors are sort of operating at the national level and that they are sort of all sort of homogeneous. Whereas if you go to the global level, you have sort of actors with different spatial reaches. Like transnational companies are able to operate all over the place, whereas certain national or regional companies are only able to operate in their respective contexts. The same is true for associations, for universities, finance, etc. So all the actors have potentially multi-scalar structures or have a certain reach of activity. You can also apply this to global networks or even to global institutional structures like global regimes, for instance. And the same is true for the functions. So let's say for knowledge generation, let's say this is all about economic geography. You have sort of big databases on publications and patents, and you can sort of try to identify the multi-scalar structure of knowledge generation. I will come back to that in an illustration. Same is for guidance of search. Where are the standards defined? This can be global standards, national standards, etc. And you have all the standard wars, etc. And that come into place. Market formation can happen at different places. Legitimacy, as we see very currently, that the murdering of a black man in the US leads to a global protest wave. That is. Sort of questioning the fundamental legitimacy of how police is organized. Let's say the regime of the police is, social technical regime of the police is organized, etc. So long story cut short, we have all these processes may happen at different levels. And the question is, how can we address these sort of, this innovation system, this technological innovation system that has these different layers of activities. So I guess there's only two conceptual innovations or new ideas that you have to elaborate in more detail. The first question is these system structures or these externalities, these system externalities, where do they happen? And if you assume that not everything is in a big container, but you have sort of sub-elements, then you have to define what subsystems are. And they can be at the national level, at the regional level, or even is constructed through sort of multinational networks of cities or whatever. It doesn't have to have a territorial boundary. And if you have these subsystems, where certain things can happen, then you, of course, in order to have an overall innovation system dynamics, these developments have to be coupled. If they're totally independent, then well, you might have perhaps competing innovation systems in different places of the world, but let's say in general, you would want to tap into the resources that you find in different places around the world. So this led to a definition of transnational technological innovation systems, which we finally called or labeled as global innovation systems, and we'll come back in the work groups with this, to say this is a network set of partly independent subsystems, which are characterized by internal system interdependencies. So they constitute sort of small or partial innovation systems, and which in their interaction are necessary for maturing an innovation, which means that they all contribute to the ultimate success of the innovation. And let's say one novelty is that we identify a new kind of system failure that could result in sort of missing transnational linkages among the different subsystems. Here you have a sort of a depiction of this global innovation system. And just to make it very short, so here we also in the paper, we had the example of a vaccine development for HIV/AIDS, where you have actors like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation who are globally operating. They're mobilizing resources, their own resources, of course. You have perhaps the WHO that's also operating, trying to coordinate at the global level. You have some transnational companies that see an interest in tapping into this, you know, NGOs, etc., and they mostly just work on mobilization of resources, investments, and partly also on legitimation. Let's say the development of the vaccine perhaps happens in certain regional clusters, you know, the regional innovation systems that are specialized in terms of vaccine development in China or in Germany, etc. And let's say the markets, the test markets would be in particular places which are extremely hard hit by the HIV/AIDS crisis, like in South Africa, etc. So different things can happen in different places. And the crucial thing is how are these processes interconnected? Let's say I would try to go even a bit quicker over this part. If you have read the paper, you will know that. The question is, well, what is this if we got to this point, you know, of this sort of graphical structure? Essentially, this is a sort of a mapping device, a three-dimensional or rather hierarchical mapping device, but still it's a sort of a mapping device. Then you could say, okay, the geographers, they want to map their ultimate reason of existence to put out maps. And of course, that's not good enough, you know. So the question is, what can you do with this? What can you better explain, better understand in the dynamics? And the first step towards explanation was to say, well, can we already know beforehand whether certain sectors are perhaps more dependent on global coordination, whereas others are perhaps more developing in specific regional contexts, or where countries, you know, that start with a certain technology will be able to maintain global leadership because they had a head start. So can we predict a little bit or have an idea which sort of sectors and industries would end up in what sort of configurations of these different levels of innovation system structures? And we just, to do that, we identified like two major dimensions to derive a typology. The first one is oriented at the knowledge, the tradability of knowledge. And knowledge is also the one dimension that's sort of dealt with mostly in innovation studies and in economic geography. And we distinguish between an STI mode and DUI mode. STI means more like codified knowledge, you know, scientific knowledge that can easily be written down in patents or publications. And the other extreme is sort of the DUI mode, which is more dependent on tacit knowledge and experience, etc. And the second dimension is more about institutional embedding, and we called it the valuation dimension, which is more about how to legitimize, how to build up markets, how to embed in specific institutional contexts. There we have two expressions of either, let's say, these valuation practices are freely expandable, or they depend very much on local context. An example for a freely expandable technology would be a smartphone. You know, once you have developed a smartphone, you can sell it globally, and there's no big difference, or a vaccine, let's say. Whereas a customized example would be a technology that you have to implement in very local contexts, like urban water management or certain consultancy services, legal services. You really have to know a lot about the local context to really make it flow. And it will also be different across different stages of maturation. So the hypothesis is that depending on the combination of this, the kind of innovation and valuation conditions, you would expect that, let's say, certain aspects would be more easily tradable across space, and so would be rather coordinated at the global level. Whereas if they're not so mobile, then we would rather see local anchoring and dependency on local conditions. Then we came up with this table with the four types of global innovation system configurations: the market anchored, the footloose GIS, the spatialistic GIS, and the production anchored GIS. And if you go into one of these fields, then you see you can formulate sort of hypotheses or indicators to identify whether a specific technology would just fit into this corner in terms of the functions or the resources, as we call them: knowledge, financial investment, market formation, legitimation, what kind of structural couplings you would expect. And we also provided some typical examples. So with this, you can then go in and sort of depict, map out certain global innovation system structures. Like here, it's for photovoltaics around the 2000s. Which countries are active in which sort of activities. And you can also see if you know a policymaker in one of these countries, like in the US, you can see, well, how densely connected are the resources in my country, and how does it fare compared to other countries? How do I depend, and through which sort of channels and structural couplings, on global processes? And then you can start to define a sort of a national policy in a global innovation system context. And you can also say, especially according to the maturation cycle of technologies, that these categorizations may not be stable over time. They may also move. So what we saw in the German case, the PV, solar PV TIS, which you saw on the upper left corner, started more in a sort of customized valuation corner with the local initiatives, etc. But of course, with more and more standardization, it became a sort of standardized valuation and moved to the upper right, and also became more footloose, and it was also very difficult because of that for German inventors to maintain their initial advantage compared to wind power, for instance. Let me just, in order to not run too much out of time, just very shortly introduce you to how can you now even measure that. So is this sort of only a, let's say, qualitative, broadly abstract way of looking at the world, or can you also identify these processes more specifically? And the first dimension, which is sort of easy, as I said already, is if you look at the dimension of knowledge generation. So we have global databases where we can map out, whether where the centers of activity are, the centers of capabilities also. And by this, assume a little bit where would we expect, let's say, a new industry to emerge from its competence base. So here we had a technology, membrane bioreactors, which started on a global level. They didn't start in any region or country, but rather through transnational companies. And over time, this global or multi-scalar process sort of clustered in certain countries. And here you see some cases that are highlighted. So you see, first of all, the global network of its co-authorships of scientific publications. So you see that there's a strong transnational and transcontinental interaction. And you see some countries like South Korea that have quite a dense interaction structure, or Germany, who is sort of a core in the European context, whereas North America or the US more particularly has very little inside and outside connections. So we would expect that there's very little innovation system dynamics going on, etc. So you can map this out and already make some predictions about where you would expect some processes rather to happen or not. But the problem is, what do you do with the other dimensions that are not, where you don't have global databases that are, over long periods of time and systematically developed? And so we recently started, so this is really a very recent paper that's under review now in economic geography, to tackle the legitimacy dimension. And we assess this through mentionings in newspaper articles, and we tapped into a global database of newspaper articles and coded, which sort of statements legitimized niche technologies or regime technologies, and derived from that a sort of suitability index, if you want, for new niche markets to emerge. So let's say here you could ask the question, which are the regions where you would expect new niche markets to emerge first? Whereas the upper part was where would you expect the knowledge to be densest and the industry to grow first? And this can obviously be in different places. And the last, then we also saw that there's a lot of trade in narratives, so in legitimacy among places, so you also have a multiscalar structure here. So in the end, what we can do is through also applying a new method, which is called the discourse network analysis method, we can even retrace regime niche dynamics as social technical configurations. And by measuring the co-mentioning of certain concepts in the discourses. And here you see such a concept network where, let's say, the blue dots are the regime technologies or regime dimensions, the green ones are the niche dimensions. And the more central or big a certain symbol is, the more often it has been mentioned by actors. So you see that at the global level, there's quite a dominance and stability of the social technical regime configuration. Whereas if you go down to the regional level, here the US, you see that over the 3 periods of time from 2011 to 2018, you see that these niche technologies moved more center stage, got more strongly aligned. So actually what you can see here is a sort of a spatially differentiated transition dynamics that you can depict with these sort of methods. So long story cut short, so we're increasingly getting to the methods to really identify these multiscalar processes and to really also give flesh to the bone to these geography questions and the wheres and the hows. So let me just finish so with some outlooks. So what are the expected benefits for elaborating the geography transitions? Of course, conceptually to address the spatial dimension, methodologically to also be able to better compare different storylines, normatively how the question about sustainability for whom and to radical for whom, and empirically we can elaborate or venture into new contexts outside of Western Europe, I would say, to analyze these sort of processes on an equal footing. So there's specifically global aspects, as I showed you, are this interrelation between the local embedding and the transnational coupling. If you go into sort of development questions, you can then approach this from a catch-up point of view. So what can specific countries do to get a stronger position in the global economy? Or you could also rather come from a bottom-up approach and to say, well, how can sort of appropriate technology innovations be scaled up and proliferated across space? So the last point is about policy. So is this relevant at all for policymakers, or is this just for geographers? Of course, and we have a lot of evidence on that national policymakers are increasingly bugged by, let's say, the global reality of innovation processes and sectoral dynamics. So as I described before, the question of how can we identify where our country is and how to relate to processes that happen in different places is a very, very important question. For the regional level or even the firm level, so the question is also who should we team up with? Should we only interconnect at the local scale, or should we have strategic interactions with other places? And how can we do that? And how can we create new paths of development, etc.? And at the global level, of course, as I said at the very beginning, we don't have a lot of coordinative institutions for industrial policy or for transition policies. And we're confronted a little bit with some sorts of innovators' dilemma at the level of individual countries. Who should take the lead in order to push for a certain technology? So historically it was Germany. You should all be grateful for Germany. They did the job. But let's say, actually there was a lot of arguments against, even then after time within Germany, whether this has been a reasonable move. And yeah, so the question is, should there be incentives for countries to move ahead in certain directions, and how could this look like, and what sort of global coordinative institutions would we need for that? Okay, so as promised in the very beginning, it has been quite a roller coaster. I hope you still bear with me. I only see like 2 people and 1 left in between. So I guess we would have some time, perhaps 5 minutes or so, if you have sort of questions for understanding. before we move to the group work, can you perhaps raise hands, or what's the best form, to do that?
I'll open up the chat box, and then we'll see whether people have a question, or they can also just raise their hand.
Okay, just a second.
Yep. Maybe collect a few. I've seen Amir is also, Niels, yeah. Anyone else? All right, so we've got 3 questions. 4, in view of time, try to keep the question brief, and we'll take them all. Hope you manage, Bernard, 4 questions at a time. So I've got here Amir, Niels, Renata, and then Daniel. Amir?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. I had decided to not ask question today, be more passive and receptive, but it's you, Bernard, and I couldn't resist anymore. So, because in your presentation, in your article, you're talking about externalities, but you're just managing positive externalities. I want to ask about negative externalities, not just environmental negative externalities, but the negative externalities between actors, incumbents and new entrants. And the second question with you about structural couplings. What's just structural coupling? What about dynamics that couple with one another? I can say co-dynamics. So that would be my question.
Thanks, Amir. Niels? Hello, Niels? Niels? I think you're muted. Sorry, I can't hear you. All right, Renata, you go first, and Niels tries to fix his audio.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. Okay, Niels is there.
Yeah, go ahead, Niels.
All right, sorry. I would also like to thank you very much for your presentation, and I have just 2 questions. The first would be, as you showed the functions of the global innovation system, the list is shorter than compared to the TIS framework. Could you maybe elaborate why you reduced the list and how you came to that conclusion? And the second would be if you see that with the introduction of the global innovation system that maybe there's some kind of convergence between TIS and global innovation system and multi-level perspective, because we also now have the structural or the levels that are available in the multi-level perspective now in an innovation system context.
Yes.
Thanks.
Good, thank you.
Yep, and then Renata?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Truffaut, for the presentation. I was actually, prior to the workshop, thinking whether this approach would be interesting for my PhD. And what I was thinking about, what I wanted to ask you is, for example, for me, it seemed, I'm not really sure if I understand, for example, if you would use this framework, would you go from a position where you strongly assume that the technologies that you are analyzing are actually global innovation systems? Or in case, for example, because at the beginning of your analysis, you actually only have assumptions, but sometimes you're not sure. But in cases, for example, where you think that there is something there, but then what would be the gain? So imagine I would run the GIS for my research because I think that there is something there. But what if at the end I find out this technology is actually not a GIS? What would have I found out anyways? I mean, what is the...
Very good point. Very good point.
Right, thanks, Renata. A final question, Daniel, and then we'll get over to Benno.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. When you showed how to measure GIS, you showed the global discourse analysis. So you kind of show like the regime is dominant, and then we have a bit more niche. And then in the graphs you showed, it seemed like in the end, the last years, there's less niche than before. I would like to know if that change in niche prominence can be attributed to something that you found out during your analysis, or was just purely mentioning the number of, or counting the mentioning of niche dynamics, if you know what I mean.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I have to be very short, I guess, to not eat into any of the others. But these are very good questions to start with. Let's say first with Amir, with the externalities, whether they can be negative. Yes, of course. But to be fair, this is one of the big open topics especially in TIS analysis. I would even say in the whole of innovation systems approaches, because there was always an assumption that, let's say, innovation systems, they are driven by a sort of a common cause. All the actors want to promote the technology, and so it's all about how we organize that. There's a disregard of power, of competition, of negative externalities. This has been mentioned in the literature. Florian Kern made it once in a short contribution, a viewpoint, quite explicitly. And so the short answer is this is one big topic to address. For me, it goes together with the big question of directionality. So how can we identify, in innovation systems, but also in niche development, whether a certain technology is developing really in a direction of sustainability, or whether in the end we will be worse off with promoting this sort of technology. This is also one of the big topics that we haven't really tackled explicitly in the transitions community. So do not go further into that. Great question. Start to work on that. There's a big gaping open field that you should tackle, and people are starting to address it. And this will also change the approaches quite fundamentally. The co-dynamics, I have to say, I didn't understand really, and I would prefer to move on to another question because I have so little time to deal with all of them. But you can always send me an email later, and then I will respond to your question by email. So the question about functions, the 7 functions or the 8 functions or the 6 functions versus our 4 resources. Again, very short. A big problem of the functions approach is that there is no conceptual basis. So they have been inductively derived, from the literature. And I guess they have some plausibility and some robustness, and there's nothing really fundamentally wrong with them. But if you would want to say, is it really the 7, or should they be distinguished, or how is the relationship between the functions? You don't really have a basis to do that. And so our reduction to 4 resources was a little bit driven also by the pushback from geographers who said, well, what's about the 7? Well, let's just boil it down to these 4, which are more easily understandable. But for me, this is still a very open field, which even me personally, I have tried a couple of times to give a more deductive analysis of the functions, and even together with Marco Heckert, I had once a project to do that, but we have failed so far. So this is sort of a weakness. If you wonder about the synthesis between TIS and MLP, yes, but this cannot only be done through the Global Innovation Systems framework. Let's say the Global Innovation Systems framework, I would always claim, is sort of an integrative framework for all the innovation systems frameworks, national, regional, sectoral, technological. And so you can accommodate all of their arguments within the Global Innovation System framework. If you really want to have a marriage or a merger, or however you want to describe the relationship between MLP and GIS and innovation systems, you would have to elaborate, and we are doing that already at different fronts, the multiscalar structure of the regime. So the social technical regime has certain global structures, but then has also variation at the national and the subnational level. And so you would first have to conceptualize what's the degree of freedom or the degree of variation at these lower levels. And then you could perhaps say, well, this indicates to you some sort of places where transitions are more easily doable. And let's say the forces that will develop the alternatives, they probably structures in some global innovation systems. But the two are sort of complementary. You cannot collapse it into one. You know? So I guess that's, again, the short answer to that. Renata, yeah, this is also very good. We will come back in the work tasks now. Let's say we struggled with the labeling of the approach. Actually, the framework is actually only a multi-scalar, or not only, it is even more general, it's a multi-scalar innovation system approach and not a global per se. You know, so but we finally decided to call it global because, frankly, it's sold better. It's sort of easier to grasp. You know, to say global innovation system. So, well, everything that happens downstairs, you take it with it. Then to say we have a new concept that's called the multi-scalar innovation system, which is sort of would be an oddity. But your point is very well taken, you know, and we will have one group that will really talk about this. And you might have certain technologies where the global dimension doesn't play any role, you know. So where you really, it starts in some local context and then it diffuses through the world without any coordination at the global level. It's a bit hard to imagine, you know, in the extreme, but it could be very well that certain technologies, especially the more sticky ones, the locally sticky ones, they don't develop strong global structures. Whereas others, for instance, the computer game industry, which I started to learn about quite recently, has a sort of very global structure. It has then also some variations, you know, in national context and cultural context, but essentially, you know, you can just deploy this on a global scale eventually, you know. So, you know, you have all the extremes. Everything happens at the global scale, everything happens at the local scale, but in general, the structures will be multi-scalar. And so you have to determine, you know, the type of GIS structure that is appropriate for your case. And if there's nothing happening at the global scale, then it's not your fault, you know, that's just how it is, you know. And let me just go to the last part. Niche performance, how measured? Yeah, I would have to go more into the details of this method. So it's not really only counting, you know, counting the occurrence, what you would have in normal discourse analysis, but it's sort of the co-mentioning. So it measures the alignment between concepts. And of course, the more people mention two concepts at the same time, the stronger the relationship, the link in the graph will grow. And the more they are shared, you know, by many actors, the more it will move to the center. So if you want what we are depicting, and this is really quite amazing, I have to say, we can really sort of identify social technical configuration as they align. You know, you would see over time, if you have certain concepts that grow together and that they form like packages, you know, that are nearer to each other. And if they become dominant, they will move to the center. And that's the, let's say, the hunch that we have here for this method. But let's say this is really hot from the press, you know. So we have the first paper in resubmission and the second paper that we're really fighting for. But we believe that this is really sort of or has the potential for a breakthrough for a sort of configurational analysis, you know, compared to the conventional just counting occurrences analysis. Sorry, this was again very rushed, but very good questions. They go straight to the core, and I guess they even go straight to the work group tasks.